Do you remember the good old days before the ghost town? We danced, we sung, and the music played in the boomtown. Do you recognise those lyrics? It's from the Specials, and it was a number one hit from the early 1980s, and they were singing about the decay that was happening in the UK at that particular time. Obviously, they can remember a time in the UK where things were booming, where things were better. But they felt compelled to write a song about the urban decay that they were seeing right in front of their eyes that were taking place at that time. In the previous upload that I made, I was talking about what it was like for me personally being part of Generation X. That's the generation that were born sort of 1964, 1965 through to the 1990s. Generation X. And I was reminiscing about the good things that I recall as a young person growing up in that particular time period. But what you do find with most generations is that generation will blame the generation before them for all the problems that they are now facing. It's always been the previous generation's fault for the difficulties that generation are now facing. And that generation was going to be the generation that sorted out all of mankind's problems. I read it many, many times about the boomer generation, my parents' generation, and how good they had it. And they were the lucky generation. They were the generation that are now living in their expensive houses. And now they've got their expensive houses. They pulled up the ladder for everybody else. Nobody else can afford to own a nice house. They've taken all the resources and hoarded it for themselves. This has resulted in a lot of resentment towards that boomer generation. But as I said, my parents are from a boomer generation, and personally speaking, I don't find the boomer generation to be a problem. I don't find the silent generation to be a problem. I think they, like us, had good things in their life and they had bad things in their life, and they made the most with what they were given. Just like Generation X, we made best with what we had. Some of it was good and some of it was bad. I look back at times in the past and there's things I admire about people in the past. I see a lot of younger people and they don't admire or respect the lives that older people have built for themselves. As I say, I think newer generations always think they've got a load of problems that they've been left with by previous generations, and they're going to be the generation that makes everything perfect and happy for everybody once again. As good as the 80s were, as I highlighted in my previous upload, obviously I'm not naive enough to believe that everything was a bed of roses. Obviously there were things going on in the 80s that people maybe a little bit older than me were struggling with. If someone or a band like the Specials, who were obviously slightly older than me, could see it and sing about it, there was obviously something going on in the UK at that time. I don't want to get political or make this a political channel, but generally when there's a problem, it's always caused by the government, and people take sides, don't they? Either they err towards a left-wing government or a right-wing government. And the left wing will blame the right-wing government, and right-wing people will blame left-wing government for all their problems. It's just the way it is. No matter what your take on the world is, people will always blame the governments, and for good reason, for the problems that are taking place. And the government, when I was a child, is a very well-known government. Everybody knows exactly who the Prime Minister was in the 1980s. The Iron Lady. Everybody knows exactly who she was and what she did to the UK. And even though I was young, I think it boiled down to whereabouts you lived in the UK. I was obviously in the southeast of the UK, and I remember as a young person, a lot of people were very prosperous at that particular time in history. They had nice cars. They were buying nice houses. So there was obviously a massive divide between the north and the south at that particular time, and the south was benefiting from that particular government. Up north, though, things were different. I might be wrong here, so please, in your comments, let me know if you're from the north, what it was like. I say, at that time, I was 10 years old. I was a young child, so I don't know the full extent of what things were like, but I knew that industry in the UK was being closed down. The mine pits were being closed down. People were suffering. People were losing their livelihoods. There were strikes going on. There was protests going on. Youth unemployment was absolutely massive. Now, that is one thing I do recall moving forward just a few years later to probably when I was 14, 15, 16, the awareness that it wasn't easy to find a job at that particular time. Things were bleary. The outlook wasn't very good. But I do remember the government set up something called the Youth Training Scheme, the YTS. It was sort of like an apprentice where you sort of got a basic income, but you learnt a trade. My generation, Generation X, were also called the latchkey generation. We were a generation that came home to an empty house. We'd let ourselves in. We learned how to look after ourselves. When we were younger and we had to go to school and it was pouring down with rain, it was freezing cold, there was deep snow. We didn't get taken to school by our parents. We went out in all sorts of weather and went to school. That hardened us up. That prepared us for life. Endurance. To be mature. To be responsible adults. To be reliable adults. To take things seriously. To do a job well. They were things that were kind of taught to us. The importance of having that type of independence and personality. But times, obviously, in the 80s, due to government cuts or whatever, times were tough for a lot of people in the UK. As I say, it all wasn't a bed of roses for everybody, even though there was people that obviously were doing extremely well, because the 80s were also remembered as a decade of greed. We were encouraged to become wealthy, to spend a lot of money, to buy nice things, to impress other people with what we'd got. And I think it was that decade where those little seeds were sown. The seeds of greed. Do you remember that? Loads of money. Do you remember that expression? There was a desire to have and display and show other people how successful you were. The car you were driving, the property you owned, all that kicked off, if I recall correctly, in the 1980s. So yes, there was a lot of good things about the 1980s being a Generation Xer. But again, like I say, there was also a very dark side about the 80s. Another thing I can specifically remember as a child, you were sort of conditioned to live in fear of something. There's always been an event or something to keep you in constant fear about, something bad that was about to happen to everybody, something bad that was going to happen to the human race. When I was young, I might have got this wrong, but I'm pretty sure, though, that when I was young and at school, we were taught or we were told that the next ice age was just around the corner. Yeah, you heard that right. The next ice age was just around the corner. But that wasn't the biggest thing we were conditioned to believe. The biggest thing that we were made to be fearful of was the Russians. Those pesky, nasty Russians were about to annihilate us. They were about to drop an atomic bomb on us. I remember movies on the TV, movies we were shown in school of how to prepare for a nuclear war. There was Reagan, there was Gorbachev, it was the Cold War. Who was going to push that red button first? That was a fear that was installed in us as children to be prepared for a nuclear war. And we know this is a fact because, again, there were songs written about it. Who remembers Frankie Goes to Hollywood and Two Tribes? That song was specifically about the United States and Russia and the threat of nuclear war. They also did the cover. I can't remember who did the original version of it. And that song was called War. Again, we're talking about the Cold War. That threat that was constantly put upon young children that we were going to be facing. Pretty sure, 99% sure, in fact, that we were going to be annihilated by a nuclear war any day soon. Armageddon had arrived. We also had Sting. Do you remember that? And what did Sting sing about? What did Sting sing about? I hope the Russians love their children too. So it wasn't just us that were worried. It was also the Russians. The Russians thought that they were going to be attacked by an atomic bomb. Constant fear was conditioned into us. But we didn't just have the threat of a nuclear war. I remember working in London when I got my first job, and when I was walking around London, I could see massive billboards, huge, ginormous billboards on London with that big disease with a little name. It's always these pop songs that bring these things to our attention, isn't it? The pop stars knew about it. It was a song by Prince, Sign of the Times, and he was talking about the AIDS. It was everywhere. We were bombarded by AIDS. Warnings about AIDS. How it was basically going to wipe out mankind. So not only did we have a nuclear war to worry about, the threat that we were all going to be blown to smithereens in the 80s, we also had the threat of mankind being wiped out by AIDS. And then moving forward to the 90s, it was the ozone layer. There was this massive hole in the ozone layer, and it was going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. But with time, these things just stop. They just stop scaring us. We don't hear any more about being annihilated by an atomic bomb. We never hear about AIDS anymore. You just don't hear about it. You don't hear about the ozone layer. But something else comes along to keep you in a state of constant fear. You can sound a little bit like a conspiracy theory, but when you get to a certain age, when you get to my age, Generation X, you notice this pattern of every decade there's something new to keep you in fear that the Earth's about to end. Nuclear war, AIDS, hole in the ozone layer, global warming, COVID, viruses. Something's going to get you in the next month. The whole of humankind is going to be wiped out. You see a pattern. And that's another good thing about being a Generation Xer. You've been on this planet long enough to see how things work. You see how you're influenced and conditioned by the media. You see so much of it, and you become so much wiser as a person of my age. Like I say, I can look back on things with great fondness. Music, the cars, the freedom we had growing up as a child, no social media, no being tracked through a smartphone, no Facebook, no TikToking. Great times, fantastic times. And you compare that to today's generation and the pressure that they have to face. And today's generation are going to be blaming generation, what is today's generation? Generation Alpha, is it? And they'll be blaming Generation Z, who will be blaming Generation Millennials, and the Millennials will be blaming Generation X, and Generation X will be blaming the Boomers, and the Boomers will be blaming the Silent Generation. It's just a wheel that goes round and round and round. Good times and bad times. So that's it as a Generation Xer. That's the thing I've learned as a Generation Xer. That there's good and there's bad and there's conditioning going on. And with that, you've got lots of stories and experiences you can share with everybody. And that's what, that's what I'm going to try and do through this YouTube channel. Just go through some of my life's experiences, what it's like growing up, and sharing some of those experiences with other people, with people of my age as well, that can give comments and let me know of what their experiences of life is like and whether or not it's matched mine. Thanks for watching, everybody. I hope you found this interesting. As I said, I don't really want to take this little channel down any political road or sort of talk about politics or anything like that. But anyway, as I say, I hope you've enjoyed this, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Take care, everybody, and have a great day.